By the late 1980s, many Americans believed the darkest chapters of government secrecy were finally behind them. The Cold War was winding down. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The enemy that had justified so much fear simply disappeared. But institutions built on secrecy do not vanish when the threat fades. They adapt. Inside intelligence agencies, MKUltra was no longer spoken of openly, but its influence lingered. The language changed. The budgets shifted. The experiments became cleaner, more technical, and far more difficult to trace. Instead of crude drugging and isolation chambers, the focus moved toward data, behavior modeling, and psychological profiling. The human mind was still the target. Only the methods evolved. In the 1990s, advances in neuroscience and computing opened new doors. Brain imaging technologies like MRI and PET scans allowed scientists to observe neural activity in ways that had once been impossible. Behavioral psychology merged with data science. Patterns could be measured. Predictability could be calculated. Officially, this research was about mental health, national defense, and improving soldier resilience. Unofficially, critics worried that the same old question remained, unanswered and dangerously tempting. How much influence is too much? After the attacks of September 11, 2001, fear returned with renewed intensity. National security once again became the ultimate justification. New laws expanded surveillance powers. Black sites appeared. Interrogation methods were redefined. And once again, psychological boundaries were tested. Techniques once explored under MKUltra, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation. Psychological pressure re-emerged under different names. The government insisted these methods were legal, controlled, and necessary. But human rights organizations raised alarms. Whistleblowers described practices that echoed the past. The debate was no longer hypothetical. It was happening in real time. At the same time, the private sector began doing what governments once attempted in secret. Corporations collected massive amounts of data search histories, social behavior, emotional patterns. Algorithms learned what people feared, desired, and believed. Influence no longer required drugs or confinement. It required screens. Social media platforms demonstrated how easily perception could be shaped. Information could be amplified or buried. Emotions could be triggered at scale. Entire populations could be nudged without realizing they were being nudged at all. Some former intelligence officials openly admitted it. If MKUltra were attempted today, it would not need laboratories. It would need data. This realization reframed MKUltra's legacy. The program was no longer just a historical scandal. It was a warning one that applied to the modern world more than ever. The victims of MKUltra were never fully counted. Many never knew what had been done to them. Others struggled for decades with trauma they could not explain. Families were left with questions that would never be answered, and accountability remained limited. No senior officials went to prison. No intelligence leaders stood trial. The system apologized but did not punish itself. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth. MKUltra did not fail because it was immoral. It ended because it was exposed. That distinction matters because it means the safeguard was not ethics. It was visibility. As long as secrecy prevailed, anything was possible. Today, MKUltra is taught in textbooks and referenced in documentaries. It is framed as a lesson learned, a line that will never be crossed again. But history shows that lines are rarely erased. They are redrawn. The story of MKUltra forces a deeper reflection on power and trust. Governments are created to protect their people. Intelligence agencies exist to prevent catastrophe. But when fear dominates decision-making, even protective institutions can become threats. The individuals involved in MKUltra were not monsters in their own minds. Many believed they were patriots, scientists, defenders of democracy. That belief did not stop the harm. And that may be the most dangerous lesson of all. Because the greatest abuses rarely begin with cruelty. They begin with certainty. Certainty that the cause is just. Certainty that the enemy is real. Certainty that there is no alternative. MKUltra reminds us that democracy is not defined by what happens in public, but by what is prevented in secret. The question is no longer whether such a program could exist again. The question is whether we would recognize it if it did, because the battlefield has changed. The tools are subtler. The influence is quieter. And the human mind remains the most contested territory on Earth. Even decades after MKUltra was officially shut down, one fact continued to disturb historians and investigators alike. The story was never truly finished. Too many files were missing. Too many names were redacted. Too many decisions were explained away with the same phrase, national security, when Congress attempted to impose oversight after the 1970s investigations. Intelligence agencies complied publicly while resisting quietly. New rules were written, but enforcement depended on the very institutions those rules were meant to restrain. Oversight committees were briefed but only on what agencies chose to reveal. Secrecy remained intact. Several former CIA officers later admitted that. MKUltra was not an isolated moral failure, but part of a broader culture where results mattered more than limits. The pressure to stay ahead of enemies real or imagined created an environment where ethical hesitation was seen as weakness, and that culture did not vanish with one exposed program. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, classified research into human performance, stress tolerance, and behavioral conditioning continued under military and intelligence funding. Officially, these programs focused on helping soldiers survive extreme environments. But critics argued that the line between resilience and manipulation was still dangerously thin. The language had changed. The intent remained ambiguous. Whistleblowers who tried to speak out often paid a heavy price. Careers were destroyed. Security clearances were revoked. Some faced legal action under secrecy laws. Others were quietly discredited. The message was clear. Certain truths were not meant to surface. In 1995, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order strengthening protections for human subjects in government research. It was a direct response to past abuses, including MKUltra. The order acknowledged, in subtle language, that the US government had failed its citizens before. But acknowledgements are not accountability. Many MKUltra victims never received apologies. Some died without knowing why their lives had fallen apart. Others were misdiagnosed for years, treated for symptoms without understanding their cause. Families searched for answers that no archive could fully provide. What makes MKUltra especially haunting is how ordinary its beginning was. It did not start with mass cruelty or open violence. It began with meetings, memos, funding requests, and professional language. It grew quietly, shielded by bureaucracy. This is how dangerous systems survive. Not through chaos, but through routine. As technology advanced, the possibility of influencing behavior without direct experimentation became more real. Marketing, psychology, political messaging, and behavioral economics showed how easily choices could be guided. The same principles, intelligence, agencies once chased through drugs and isolation were now visible in everyday life. The battlefield no longer required consent, only attention. This raised a new ethical dilemma for the modern age. If influence can be exercised subtly, legally, and invisibly, who is responsible for protecting the public mind? MKUltra taught the world what happens when that responsibility is ignored. Today, intelligence agencies insist that the abuses of the past cannot happen again. Oversight exists. Laws are stronger. Transparency is greater. And yet, many MKUltra documents remain classified, not because they are irrelevant, but because they are still sensitive. Sensitive to whom? And why? That question continues to haunt scholars, journalists, and civil liberties advocates. Because history has shown that the most dangerous experiments are not those that fail, but those that succeed quietly. MKUltra did not create mind control, but it proved something equally unsettling. It proved that fear can override democracy, that secrecy can overpower ethics, and that ordinary people can become invisible victims when power is left unchecked. This is not a story about the past alone. It is a warning carried forward, because the moment a society stops questioning what is done in its name, it risks becoming complicit. And the moment secrecy becomes unquestionable, abuse becomes inevitable. The final legacy of MKUltra is not found in declassified files or government apologies. It lives in a single unresolved truth. The greatest threat to freedom is not an external enemy. It is the quiet belief that anything is acceptable as long as it is done in secret, for our own good.